And now onto our final exotic armor tier list. We're going to be talking about Hunter. Hunters have decent exotic diversity, you know, compared to something like Titan, and they do have their own niches in endgame content. So let's get started with talking about the armor options. First off, to start our list, we have Aeon Swift. Now, Hunters obviously don't have something like Cenotaph Masks, so Aeon Swift is going to rank higher comparatively because it's their best ammo generating option. And Hunters also have a relatively, safe way of finishing mini bosses, whether we're talking Void Hunter, Arc Hunter, plenty of options available for you. So I'm going to go ahead and put Aeon Swift at the top of A tier, ranked 3rd, and we're going to leave it right over there. Next up, we have Assassin's Cowl, another top tier pick, probably not a surprise to anyone. This thing is incredibly strong on Arc Hunter, and it's pretty decent on Solar Hunter as well. You basically get full healing, you get, invisibility on any subclass that you want. It's the ultimate survival exotic on Hunter, very, very strong, enables Arc Hunter, a melee build, to have much, much higher survivability in stuff like solo GMs and in fireteam GMs. As well as just general content. It's just a great exotic. Arc Hunter already does a lot of the work when it comes to being a potent ability killer, and Cowl just helps you survive a lot better, which is something that a melee build needs very sorely. So I'm going to go ahead and put our Assassin's Cowl in the S tier. Next up, we're going to talk about Athrys Embrace, I believe. Yeah, Athrys Embrace. Athrys Embrace is kind of underrated. A lot of people don't know that the throwing knife actually does work with 1-2 punch, which is weird. Bungie is very picky about how they classify projectiles and regular melees when it comes to 1-2 punch, but have you know, throwing knife does work with it, and it does actually a very decent amount of damage. Will one-shot pretty much any mini boss. So yeah, pretty strong. That being said, you know, it is a little bit niche, and if you don't have your knife, it kind of does slow down the gameplay loop a lot. Doesn't have much to offer when it comes to splash damage, so it's really only good for mini bosses and like major targets, and even on those, it's like, And the fact that in order to get unstoppable, you need to actually hit an unstoppable champion with this knife, and they have their DR active when you hit them, so you're not going to get the knife back because you're not going to kill them. So even in that regard, for champ content, it's a little bit finicky with how you need to use it to play. That being said, I think it's a little bit underrated. It's not amazing or anything like that. I'm going to go ahead and put Athrys Embrace in the B tier. Okay, next up we have Blight Ranger. Now, Blight Ranger, I've recently been notified by some wonderful friends of mine that I was under the impression that it shitting out millions and millions and bajillions of orbs was patched in the distant past, but apparently it was not patched, and you can still pop Arc Staff, sit in front of your team, block for a little while, and kill some ads, and you'll shit out like 300 orbs. And they're big orbs, they're big super orbs as well, which means all of your team, just for you blocking and using Arc Staff for a bit, get a ton of super, like they're full super and then some. In the words of my friend Titan Skates. So with that in mind, Blight Ranger, being on Arc Staff and guarding in front of your teammates is kind of a waste of time in some endgame content, but in other endgame content, it's certainly a viable strategy at the start of a DPS phase, or even in an ad clear encounter, like an exploration encounter. So I think Blight Ranger, I've underrated it a little bit. I had it ranked pretty low before I knew that this orb interaction was patched, but it's easily the best way of getting super energy, it seems, in a large fire team. So I think we're going to place it solidly in the B tier, right at the top of B tier. It's going to be placed right next to another kind of niche-ish boss damage-esque exotic for powering up your team. And we'll talk about that when we get to that one. So next up, we have Caliban's Hand. Caliban's Hand is basically the explosive knife exotic. If you kill something, it makes an ignition. That being said, knife kills kind of fall off in GM level content, in end game content. It's not bad though. I think Caliban's is underrated a little bit by some of the end game speedrunner types. I'm not saying it's, the best exotic in the world or anything like that, but I think it is deserving of being in the B tier. I'm going to put it slightly below Athrys. I think they're ranked right next to each other, Caliban being 16 and Athrys being 15. Caliban's is more of a splash exotic, which, weighted throwing knife has that as a weakness, but it really fails to deal with majors and mini bosses, which is something that Athrys can do instead. All right, next up we have Nighthawk. Now, Nighthawk is getting a buff next season. It's getting a kind of pseudo version of Practice Makes Perfect. Getting those precision hits gives you a bit of super energy. But now, as it stands, Nighthawk is a pretty good exotic. It boosts Golden Gun damage by, I think, like around 2/3 or so. And it's you know, it makes Golden Gun the highest burst damage super in the game because you can pre-pop Golden Gun and shoot a boss as soon as it becomes damageable, and then immediately just, you know, switch to other weapons and start shooting. So it's a very, very high burst damage super. It's very, very straightforward to hit an enemy with Nighthawk. It's used in speedrunning to kill targets at a distance that need to be bursted down very quickly, in, for example, Garden of Salvation. And the fact that you can pop on Nighthawk and switch to another exotic ahead of time means that you don't need to use Nighthawk during damage. You can use a neutral exotic like Dragon's Shadow or Radiant Dance Machines or Foetracer or literally anything else of the variety of hunter damage exotics that exist. And they pair well with this thing. So I'm going to go ahead and put this thing at the bottom of A tier. Pretty solid, one of the best hunter damage exotics. And I'm glad it's, you know, it's getting the attention it deserves in the community. So it's a good exotic. All right, next up we have, what is that? Cyrtarachne's Facade. Yeah, Cyrtarachne's Facade. Okay, this exotic is okay. It's all right. I think Bungie really could have done a better job in terms of making strand exotics that are more potent. I mean, thinking about this exotic, thinking about, I mean, okay, Abeyant Leap is really good. Okay, you know, pre-suspend nerf. But thinking about stuff like Cyrtarachne's Facade, thinking about stuff like Swarmers, if we're comparing it to some of the other exotics that exist on the other classes that are exclusive to those subclasses, like Sunbracers, for example, these exotics are very weak, right? You literally just get Woven Mail on grappling. And while you do have your grapple very often on Hunter, you can also just pick up an orb. And if you're playing optimally and you're getting kills, there are orbs everywhere. There are orbs everywhere, right? So, you know, Cyrtarachne's is, you know, it's okay, I guess. Like I said with Swarmers, the only reason you're using Cyrtarachne's is because there isn't a better exotic that synergizes with Strand Hunter. And there could be a much better exotic that synergizes on Strand Hunter. There just isn't one. So that's the only reason why it's used. So yeah, pretty disappointing exotic in my opinion, and Strand Hunter is easily one of the worst subclasses in the game right now. I've talked about that extensively before on the subclass discussion I had with Above and Salted Grepo. So I'm gonna go ahead and put this thing in the C tier. You know, it's fine. It's like the best Strand interaction exotic, but you know, that's mediocre, right? Okay, next up we have Foetracer. Now Foetracer recently got a bit of a role swap with Knucklehead Radar, and it now gives you it gives you surges. It gives you surges just for damaging an enemy. So anytime you do ability damage to an enemy, you get 4 subclass matching surges for 10 seconds. And there is a way to kind of glitch Foetracer so that you have infinite duration. It's relating to do with armor charge, I believe. But let's say you're not doing that. This is still a very good exotic. Very, very good on Solar Hunter, for example, with Apex Predator. Given that you can throw a knife at your target, or you can throw like a fusion grenade at a target. And all of the ticks of damage that those abilities do will give you 10 seconds of match subclass surge, which is really great because then you can run, you know, 3 kinetic surges or something like that. So there are a lot of exotics where people cope and, you know, they say you can run like 2-3 or 4-3 on stuff like, you know, Sanguine Alchemy. I think Foetracer is the prime example of an exotic where that actually ends up panning out. On the other exotics, you compromise too much, or the surge boost isn't big enough. On Foetracer, I think it's just right. It's a great damage exotic that boosts total damage, and it actually evens out, and it competes with the likes of Radiant Dance Machines and stuff like that if a boss is like Izzyable, for example. And the Izzy buff next season is only going to change that in Foetracer's favor, so I'm happy that it exists. Let's put Foetracer, I think I've placed it in the A tier. I'm going to place it in the A tier. We're going to place it above Nighthawk, but underneath Aeons. Okay, next up we have... What do we have next? Frosties, yeah, Frosties. Frosties are basically they're kind of like Eye of Another World, right? They just kind of boost your abilities for doing essentially what you're doing anyways, which is like sprinting. That being said, I mean, sprinting is a little bit worse than just doing nothing, because in combat, generally, you're not sprinting because you can't shoot. You're going to be doing this in between combat. I'm going to be honest with you, Frosties are extremely situational. I use them in speedrunning between runs to like get my grenade back if I used it while I'm like waiting for my teammates, which is like not really like a real use in endgame content. They're just a neutral exotic that exists, but there's other exotics that are more specialized that are just much more likely to be used in endgame content. So Frosties, I mean, yeah, and like the sprint boost isn't really useful in PvE either. I'm going to go ahead and put Frosties in the D tier, the first D tier exotic of the day. Next up, we have Gemini Jester. Gemini Jester is bad. Yeah. Gemini Jester is, I mean, you kind of like disorient enemies near you, or in a pretty big radius actually. It's not horrible, but there, first of all, CC is not, again, not that useful in optimal endgame play, and there are other ways to apply CC that do not require you to use your class ability or use your entire armor exotic just to do it, and the misdirection only lasts 5 seconds, right? So compared to stuff like pre-nerf suspend, compared to stuff like stasis, you know, that's not great, and this exotic doesn't really do anything besides that, right? So Gemini Jester, we're gonna go ahead and place that in the F tier. Yeah, pretty useless, I would say. Okay, next up we have Graviton Forfeit. Graviton Forfeit has been known for a long time now to many solo players as the best, most consistent source of invisibility. If you're on Void Hunter, this thing basically guarantees that you are invisible 100% of the time. Now, in the sandbox that we are in today, we're on, you know, offense best defense, like I've said before, and Hunter actually does have access to some offensive utility in the form of Solar Hunter and Arc Hunter. Void Hunter is at an all-time low when it comes to viability. That being said, you know, there are some situations, possibly in endgame content, where you would want to be invisible unconditionally, right? And Graviton Forfeit, if you're by yourself, is the best option that you have when it comes to that. So Graviton Forfeit, we're going to put it in the B tier. I'm going to place it beneath Caliban's, and we're going to call it at that. Okay, next up we have Gwisin Vest. Gwisin Vest. Yeah, this is a PvP exotic, and even in PvP, you know, you're punished for swapping exotic armor in PvP now in like trials. That being said, this is a PvE list, and I don't think I need to tell you that switching off of Deadfall Tether or Mobius Quiver for Spectral Blades in PvE is don't do that. Anyways, we're gonna put this in the F tier, and it's gonna be at the bottom of F tier, and I think it's pretty obvious why. Okay, next up we have Gyrfalcon's Hauberk. Gyrfalcon's Hauberk. I think this exotic is kind of overrated. It's good, don't get me wrong. I think this is a good example of what a balanced exotic should be. It's not overpowered. That being said, it's also not incredibly strong. Gyrfalcon's Hauberk is on a subclass that is, you know, inherently not that great, right? Like Void Hunter is, in most endgame content, overshadowed by Arc and Solar Hunter. You know, it could be useful on day one if you're like on the tether on your team and you need a tether for a boss. And in some endgame content, Void Hunter is useful. But you know, in terms of the overall scope of endgame content, not super often that you're going to be using this thing, because it's not super often that you're going to be on Void Hunter. So that being said, definitely the best neutral game Void exotic, and I have to give it points for that. So I'm going to go ahead and put it in the A tier. We're going to put it right above Nighthawk and below Foetracer. Not going to be in the S tier, sadly. Okay, next up we have Khepri's Sting. Khepri's Sting is interesting. I mean, it's focused around Smoke Bomb. Okay, you know what? I want to comment on this. In the future, I've mentioned how I'm going to make videos on adjusting the sandbox and buffing some of the underused, underloved, less appreciated exotics. And I think Void Hunter, for being a class that's all about being like a ninja, right? And like Stylus Executioner comes to mind, right? Bungie's power fantasy for Void Hunter is you're like an assassin roving in the shadows, and you come out of your invisibility and you do an attack, right? Gyrfalcon's is all about that. So are some other Void Hunter exotics. Why does Void Hunter not have some sort of knife, right? Like, why does it not have some sort of like dagger as a powered melee? It has just Smoke Bomb. It has just Snare Bomb, right? That's all it has. It would make perfect sense for Void Hunter to have a powered melee that's like a backstabbing melee. Like you come out of the shadows and you backstab something. And that would work perfectly with Khepri's Sting. Unfortunately, Bungie is like, yeah, well, the only powered melee you have on Void Hunter is Snare Bomb. And so this exotic would probably, you know, see more use if you had like an exotic like a powered melee that actually did damage, right? That was actually focused around damage on Void Hunter, and that would play perfectly into the power fantasy of being an assassin. That being said, I don't think I need to talk much more about this exotic. It's based around doing more Snare Bomb damage and giving you True Sight, neither of which is like useful in endgame content at all. I mean, the melee recharge rate is nice, but it's only while your Smoke Bomb is up, which is like, that's kind of just silly, right? So Khepri's, I'm gonna go ahead and put it in the, I think we put it in the F tier if I'm not mistaken, but I'm gonna go ahead and check. Yeah, Khepri's Sting is in the F tier. Khepri's Sting is in the F tier, ranked 36th, and I think that puts it right above Gemini Jester. Okay, next up we have Knucklehead Radar. Now Knucklehead Radar does what I believe Foetracer used to do, and that is every percentage value an enemy is below 30% HP, you gain plus 1% extra damage that stacks with everything, by the way, to that enemy. So for example, if an enemy is at 15% of their health, if a boss is at 15% of their health, you get a 15% stacking bonus on top of all of your other buffs, debuffs, whatever. So that's actually pretty useful explicitly because a lot of bosses take time to get to final stand. And so if you're on a hunter and you're not on like starter scales, you don't have a super, right? You can switch to Knucklehead Radar and boom, you suddenly have a stacking bonus that is excellent for final stands. Most bosses, their final stands are like, 15, 20% health, whatever. And boom, yeah, Knucklehead Radar is just free damage and you have plenty of time to swap to Knucklehead Radar when a boss is doing its final stand animation, getting angry, right? So this is great for stuff like day ones where you got to squeeze out that extra bit of damage if you don't have a super. It's also great for like raid speedruns too. If you, are just need a boost of damage for like a burst damage option on like something like Templar or on like Consecrated Mine, But that being said, it's pretty niche, right? It's only really used for bosses. It's not used for anything else. You're not going to be using this exotic generally, neutrally, in GMs or anything like that. So it's pretty situational. That being said, the situations that it is used in are not that uncommon. So I'm going to go ahead and put this thing in the B tier. It's going to be at the top of B tier. And we're going to leave it at that, right above Blight Ranger. I think these two exotics are very much hand in hand in what they're used in, which is, raid bosses and stuff like that. Okay. Next up, we have Liar's Handshake. Okay, Liar's Handshake. I think a lot of other people think this too, but I think Liar's Handshake is pretty hugely overrated, right? A lot of people compare what's better, Liar's or Assassin's Cowl. Liar's Handshake does the damage bonus that you get with once you punch is very minimal, very minimal. I tried to use Liar's Handshake versus Assassin's Cowl in like a solo GM the other day, and it was bad. Liar's Handshake is pretty bad. Cross counter increased damage is like almost unnoticeable in endgame content, and you are much better off using Assassin's Cowl. And in low tier content where you're not as much risk of dying, Liar's Handshake is also not useful there because Assassin's Cowl still one-shots everything. So yeah, Liar's Handshake is pretty overrated. I'm gonna put Liar's Handshake at the top of C tier, and we're gonna rank it, I think, 19th. We're gonna put it like right over here. Okay, next up we have Lucky Pants. I think Lucky Pants is also a bit overrated. Lucky Pants inherently forces you to use a primary for bursting down majors. Now, it does make up for that a little bit because the damage increase is so massive, right? Especially with the damage buff that hand cannons got to majors recently, pretty significant. However, there's more efficient ways to use your exotic armor in stuff like GMs. And the fact that 10-second lockout exists is really painful to play around. Regardless of what kind of hand cannon you're using, regardless of what kind of setup you're running, there is technically a way to use loadouts to make it so you never have that cooldown, but you're realistically not going to be doing that in endgame PvE, just like swapping loadouts rapidly while using Lucky Pants. It's not very good damage if you choose to do that because you don't get the full buff. And I don't know, Lucky Pants, it still feels like kind of a, especially after they removed holsters from this thing, it definitely feels like a, I don't know, just kind of a gimmicky exotic. Even if the damage is pretty high, I've damage tested this on stream, I've shown you guys the damage results, it's still, it leaves a lot to be desired. That being said, I'm going to put Lucky Pants in the B tier. Not a bad exotic. We're going to put it right over here, and we'll leave it at that. Okay, next up, we have Lucky Raspberry. Lucky Raspberry, I was told they buffed this thing, to work with like the jolt chain damage, and it also benefits from ionic traces a little bit. That being said, I tried using this thing in a GM the other day. I wanted to see how much the chaining refunded your grenade energy, and I gotta say, it's still pretty disappointing. Like, I was throwing this thing at like 4 enemies, and the refund on the arc bolt grenade was pretty disappointing. Yeah, this thing definitely doesn't scale into high level content, and in low level content, like, why are you using Lucky Raspberry? So yeah, it doesn't really have a place in endgame PvE. I'm gonna go ahead and put Lucky Raspberry at the top of F tier, and we're going to move on to Mask of Bakris. So Mask of Bakris pretty much has 2 niche uses. Number 1, it gives you 4 arc and stasis surges when you use your light shift, which is kind of nice. It's a free 4x surge, which is kind of like Icefall Mantle in a way, except for it gives it for 2 of your surges, and both surge affinities are quite useful, right? You have stuff like Horseman on arc, and you have stuff like Cold Comfort on stasis, right? So not horrible, number 1. And number 2, it does increase your dodge cooldown by a lot because you have like a light shift instead of a dodge. But you know, this exotic is definitely meant to be used in the short term and not in the long term. And number 3, it is used in speedrunning like a little bit occasionally to kind of do a little dash move around certain obstacles, but that's very, very niche, and I just thought I'd mention it because, you know, that is something it's used in, I guess, in endgame content. So overall, this thing is pretty niche. And if you're going to use it on something like Cold Comfort, it's very like burst oriented. You're not going to be able to use a reload dodge after you dump your first 4. So yeah, pretty niche, pretty situational. I'm going to go ahead and put Bakris in the... I think we put it in the C tier. Yeah, we put it in the C tier, right underneath Liar's Handshake. Although I think you could probably give or take. You could probably trade these out. Okay, next up we have, I think that's Mechaneer's Tricksleeves. Yeah, Mechaneer's Tricksleeves. This exotic is another of those exotics that boosts a specific weapon type, and that weapon type is a primary, and that primary is sidearms. The only thing I can really see this thing being used for is maybe boosting Forerunner damage, because Forerunner DPS is actually not that bad, and boosting its damage by 2 times is pretty good. However, you need to be critical the whole time, and the likelihood of you doing DPS without dying and being at critical health the entire time is pretty low. Like, I've seen Chicken do it, and it didn't seem very very reasonable to use in endgame content, certainly. So, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and put Mechaneers, and we're going to go ahead and put it in the D tier. We're going to put it in the D tier. I think it's like somewhere near the bottom of D tier. Yeah, it's ranked 32nd. And yeah, we're going to move on to, I believe that's the most recent addition to the Hunter roster of exotics, Mothkeeper's Wraps. So Mothkeeper's Wraps, basically you get a double charge grenade, except your grenades are now moths, and they explode into 2 moths. One moth gives your allies a very small void overshield, and the other moth does damage, right? It like does damage, makes like a big, not really big, just like an explosion near your targets, right? And I tried using this in content where you might want to use this, I guess, in content with Exteris, where you were, you know, facing enemies that maybe require you to use healing on your teammates, give them void overshields, and the damage is like pitiful. This damage is, it's really bad. It's really pitiful. And it doesn't do anything also to facilitate getting your grenade back faster, really. So yeah, this thing is kind of a closed loop when it comes to gameplay, and it, even with Exteriors, which is a really shitty grenade launcher, a really shitty exotic, to synergize with this thing, it's really weak. It's really it really leaves something to be desired. Very much a quirky gimmick, much like a lot of other armor exotics. I'm gonna go ahead and put it in the F tier. Okay, next up we have Oathkeeper. Yeah, so Oathkeeper, this thing is pretty good with like Wish Ender, right? It's pretty good with exotic bows, right? It doesn't boost Leviathan's breath damage for whatever reason, I believe. This has been tested for a while. It might change in the future, but for now it does not boost Leviathan's breath damage. However, it is good with the exotic bows, and exotic bows are at an all-time high in terms of bow stonks. We've got Trinity Ghoul, we've got Wish Ender, we've got Tikus, even stuff like Hierarchies, Le Monarch. Like, we've got a lot of good exotic bows. The primary buffs really help them out a lot. So if you're using a bow a lot, you're really focused on primary centric gameplay, this is a pretty good exotic for doing that. However, that's pretty much all it's good for, and using an exotic bow in terms of optimal endgame play, not something that you're going to do most of the time. So I'm going to go ahead and put this thing in the C tier, and we're going to leave it, I think, right below Bakris. Yeah, right below Bakris. This thing is ranked 22nd. Okay, next up we have Omni. Now, Omni, it's kind of fallen off. A lot of people don't use Omni as much anymore. In theory, this exotic is very good, and it was very good in the past, right? Whether you're skipping past enemies in a speedrun in like a GM, whether you're skipping past enemies that will kill you no matter what, like Gorgons and Vogue, whether you just need survivability, you need invisibility, and you want it to be unconditional, right? As long as there's two allies near you, you get your entire smoke bomb back, right? Omni is very, very strong in that regard. However, like I've said in the past, it is attached to Void Hunter, and unfortunately in today's sandbox, we have moved into such an offensive state that infinite invisibility is not something that's that useful anymore, and it's also something you can get on Arc Hunter, for example, using Cowl, even if it's not something that benefits your entire team. So I'm going to place Omni, fairly high on this list. We're going to put it, top 15 exotics. I'm going to rank it right over at number 13, which I believe is right over here underneath Lucky Pants. It's a pretty good exotic. It just, you know, its time to shine is kind of gone. If we ever get, you know, an activity where killing the enemies is not the goal, but, you know, sneaking past them or surviving through something is very important, Omni is going to be very, very strong. The DR is one of the strongest on-hit DRs in the game with like very little conditions. But, you know, it's just, its time is kind of come and gone. Okay, let's move on to Ophidia Spathe. Ophidia Spathe is kind of underrated. It gives you an extra melee charge, and on stuff like Knife Trick, you can insta-ignite enemies with Ember of Ashes and get both your knives back. It's pretty unique because both the melee charge share the same cooldown, so you can get your knives back very, very easily. And I think it's just kind of underrated. You know, it's not a bad exotic. You know, with Knock 'em Down, this thing is like, you know, and with Knock 'em Down and Gunpowder Gamble, this thing has like a pretty good gameplay loop. I can't lie, it's not horrible. Okay, I'm not saying this thing is going to be, you know, top tier in GMs or anything like that, but I do think it's a bit underrated. That being said, is it as strong as some of the other knife exotics higher up on this list? I do not think so. I do not think so. So I'm going to go ahead and put it right at the top of D tier, and we're going to leave it there for now. Okay, next up, we're going to talk about Orpheus Rig. Orpheus Rig, I think, is also a bit overrated. The only thing this thing is really good for in endgame PV, I guess, is like weapon leveling, or not weapon leveling, I guess catalyst farming now, because you can buy levels. If you're on Tether though, I guess for like an exhibition style encounter, like an exploration traversal style encounter, I guess it's good because you get your super back fairly quickly, and Void Hunter with I think it's a reprisal gets super pretty quickly, and Tether is still one of the best unconditional ways to CC an entire room and also still do good damage to those enemies and chain, you know, volatile explosions and stuff. So, you know, it's not horrible, but it's very very one-dimensional is what I was looking for. Very one-dimensional exotic. I'm gonna go ahead and put Orpheus in the... Where did I put Orpheus Rig, actually? I'm kind of... Yeah, I think I put it in the B tier. I think I put it in the B tier right underneath Omni. It does have the ability to give you 3 volleys when it comes to Mobius Quiver, but again, Mobius Quiver is not an exotic that's used most of the time. Even in places where you want to tether a boss in speedrunning, usually you're going to be on Star Eater scales Mobius Quiver instead if you're looking for a full 30% unconditional debuff. Okay, next up we have Radiant Dance Machines. Okay, Radiant Dance Machines, my beloved. I love Radiant Dance Machines. You guys know I love Radiant Dance Machines. I have been, ever since this thing got buffed, I have been shouting down the mountain, this, you know, trying to tell people this thing is really great for damage. It's great neutral too, honestly, I can't lie. It procs Reaper, it procs Powerful Attraction on every single dodge. They did nerf it working with Dynamo and stuff like that because that was way too busted, obviously. But it's still very good now because you only need to, your first dodge needs to be near an enemy, right? And the range is 15 meters, and now you essentially have a Rain of Fire type effect that procs Powerful Attraction, procs a Reaper on every kill. You just dodge kill, dodge kill, dodge kill, and you're just shitting orbs everywhere. Now, am I saying that this is a great neutral exotic for endgame content? No, obviously not. You're better off on Cowl or something like that. But this thing is absolutely fantastic for damage on stuff like rockets, and it's not bad in neutral gameplay either, right? It's not horrible. I think less people are inclined to use it as a neutral exotic compared to something like Rain of Fire in low-level content, but I still think it has its use in that regard. So yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and put this thing in the A tier. We're gonna put it in the A tier. I'm gonna put it right above Foetracer because I do think it is much more applicable for damage than Foetracer is in general damage scenarios. But yeah, we're gonna put it in A tier, and we're gonna leave it at that and move on. Next up, we have, I believe that is Raiden Flux, if I'm not mistaken. I don't want to be incorrect here in my picture analysis. Yeah, Raiden Flux. Raiden Flux is an Arc Staff damage buffing exotic. If I'm not mistaken, I don't remember. I haven't tested Arc Staff damage, but I believe Raiden Flux ends up being less damage DPS wise than Star Eater scales, but more total. That being said, I don't think anyone is using Arc Staff for DPS. I hope no one is using Arc Staff for DPS. And if you are using Arc Staff and not Gathering Storm, in something like a day 1, you're probably using Blight Ranger instead, which is a much more useful trade-off than hitting a boss a bunch of times with Raiden Flux to chain your damage. So I think I'm going to go ahead and put Raiden Flux in the D tier. I'm going to put it in the D tier. And we're going to put it above Mechaneer's Tricksleeves, but below Frosty's. Okay, next up we have Raiju's Harness. So Raiju's Harness is kind of like Eternal Warrior. It's like Eternal Warrior, except for you can end your super manually by default. And it doesn't give you 30 seconds of Arc Surge, it gives you 20, which is, I don't know, I mean, still kind of useful, I guess. It's a very easy way to get ×4 Arc Surge for a very, very long time. That being said, you sacrifice using Gathering Storm, and this thing does pretty much nothing for you outside of, you know, using your super. So yeah, pretty niche. I think it's probably like a little bit more useful than Raiden Flux, to be honest. So I'm gonna put it in the D tier just for that surge effect. But besides that, you know, you're pretty much never using this thing. Okay, next up we have Renewal Grasps, I believe. Yeah, Renewal Grasps. Bungie realized the error of their ways. They reverted the nerf to this exotic. It now provides its original DR effect. This is some of the highest DR you can get in the game. However, it is still gated to a grenade throw. Which granted, I tried using this thing in like a solo GM earlier just to kind of try it out, see what its cooldown was like, and I had my grenade back very quickly, to be honest with you. I had pretty much 100% uptime on this thing. It was very, very easy to use. I had my grenade basically whenever I wanted it. The only problem is you're on Stasis Hunter, number one, so your offensive utility is next to nothing. And number two, there are very few places in this game where this DR is really going to be useful. I remember people using like swords, like Lament and stuff on like Renewal Grasp builds, but that's very, very situational. There are much better ways to use Hunter's armor exotic slot. I'm going to go ahead and put Renewal Grasps into the... I think we put them in the B tier. Yeah, we put them in the B tier right underneath Lucky Pants. Okay, next up we have Sealed Ahamkara Grasps. Okay, so Sealed Ahamkara Grasps, I think they changed this exotic recently to refill all your weapons on power melee kills. It has a 7-second internal cooldown, which is kind of annoying. I was thinking of some like DPS option here where like you use something like Athrys or like a rocket or something and you melee a boss repeatedly to like reload. But I tried it. It was bad. Don't use these things for damage. And in terms of neutral gameplay exotics, there are much better neutral gameplay exotics if you're looking to just reload your weapon, like RDMs, for example. So yeah, I don't think this thing really has a place for like anything. I'm going to go ahead and put Sealed Ahamkara Grasp in the F tier, above Mothkeeper's Wraps, and we'll move on real quick. Okay, next up we have Shards of Galanor. Shards of Galanor is basically used for one thing that I was made aware of semi-recently, and that is Galanor swapping. If you pop your Blade Barrage on Star Eater Scales, and mid-cast animation, you switch to Shards of Galanor, you will get half your Blade Barrage back, and then you can switch to like Dragon's Shadow. There's a clip I think someone sent me, I think it was Biggs, of him doing a rotation on Frisia, where he casts Blade Barrage on Frisia, switches to Shards, and then switches to like Dragon's Shadow or something, or RDMs, and then yeah, he does damage that way, which is that's cool, right? That's cool. That's also extremely niche. I don't think you're going to be doing that in most scenarios. Yeah, because it's generally not going to allow you to get a second Blade Barrage for a damage phase, and I also just, yeah, it seems like a lot of work. Seems like a lot of work, and that's coming from me. So I'm going to go ahead and put Galanor in the... Where did I put it? I think it's in the C tier. Yeah, C tier makes sense for it. We're going to put it in the C tier underneath Oathkeeper, ranked 23 out of 41. Okay, next up we have Shinobus. So Shinobus, I've been told, is if you want an exotic that gives you Arc Grenade energy back, and you don't want to use, like Lucky Raspberry, Shinobus is the much better pick over Lucky Raspberry. That being said, I tried to use this again in a solo GM, and it was bad. It was bad. Skip grenades do very poor damage, and while they do, refill your grenade relatively quickly, skip grenades are just, yeah, they're just not a very good grenade, and they don't like instantly refund your grenade like right away, right? It's not like you're infinitely throwing these. So these really don't scale well into high level content or low level content, to be honest. So yeah, they're not great. I'm gonna go ahead and put Shinobus at the bottom of D tier, right underneath Mechaneers, and we'll call it at that. Next up we have Speedloaders. Okay, I think Speedloaders are a little bit underrated. Now, whether or not I move Speedloaders up or down from the tier I'm about to place them in is dependent on next season. Next season, if quick swapping doesn't get patched, Speedloaders will undoubtedly become part of damage strategies, mostly because Warlock doesn't have access to a handling boost when they're on Rain of Fire and Solar, right? There is a damage strat that I'm cooking up right now, which involves 2 lightweight shotguns and Cataphract, and using Rain of Fire. And in order to boost the handling of the Warlocks, a Hunter dodges on Speedloaders. buffing the handling of your teammates when they don't have access to handling boosts is normally not that important, but on quick swapping, it's very important. So if quick swapping doesn't get patched, expect this thing to rise through the ranks. It's going to be important in teams that are aiming to do the highest damage possible. That being said, outside of that, I mean, it's an okay neutral exotic. It's not horrible. You can keep tight fit up for a, you know, pretty... It's like Radiant Dance Machines, except for it doesn't recharge your dodge. It gives you like a crazy stat boost instead. Yeah, it's just fine. It's all right. I'm going to go ahead and put Speedloaders in the C tier. We're going to put them right underneath Mask of Bakris. Pretty situational, but if quick swapping doesn't get patched, I'm planning on probably moving these up a tier. Okay. Next up, we're going to talk about Stompies. Stompies, I'm going to rank these a little high, and that's mostly because of one thing, okay? On the other classes, the movement exotics, aka T-Steps, aka Dune Marchers, they're not essential to movement. Like, the class doesn't feel like shit if you don't have them on. Stompies are a little different. Stompies, if you don't have them on and you're doing a jumping puzzle or like any hunter movement in general, it just feels horrible. Like, I'm pretty sure everybody can attest to this. It feels horrible. And I think Stompies are by far the most essential movement exotic on any class. Like, line rampants aside, like, Hunter just feels horrible, like horrible without Stompies. I'm obviously not going to put them in S tier, but I think Stompies are actually very important to have on. I think, in fact, they're so important that even in endgame content where you're not equipment locked, people are going to have on Stompies. They're going to have on Stompies as their neutral exotic of choice over something like, you know, Rain of Fire on Warlock, where you're picking Rain of Fire over T-Steps. You're going to pick Stompies over something like RDMs in neutral gameplay. So I'm going to put Stompies, this might be a bit controversial, I'm going to put them at the bottom of A tier. That being said, if we're talking like day ones and, you know, stuff where you're actually in combat, obviously all of the exotics in B tier solo Stompies, but I just really think Stompies, it just feels awful to play. It feels awful to play Hunter, just in general, without Stompies. It's just that much of a difference for me. I might put them lower. I might put them lower later on, but I've left them at the bottom of A tier for now. And that's kind of the mantra that I have, just by the way, with the exotic armor tier list, is that when I'm comparing exotics one by one, I'm kind of thinking about, on average, how likely am I to use this exotic if I'm playing optimally? And the likelihood of you using Stompies over Knucklehead is pretty high. Like, you're more likely to use Stompies in general than Knucklehead, even in endgame content. So that's why I put Stompies where they are, compared to something like Knucklehead. I might move them down later. I'm not pressed about this. Okay. All right. Next up, we have Star Eater Scales. Star Eater Scales, they're kind of like Hoyle in that they're extremely strong in what they do, and they do not require you to play any specific subclass. Star Eater Scales are just for picking up 4 orbs, which is like the lowest cost thing ever, right? For picking up just 4 orbs, you get Overshield on Super, Full Heal on Super, and to top it off, you get a 70% boost to super damage. 70%, okay? The only other like super damage boost that is even close to that high is the 100% boost from Thunder Crash. And Thunder Crash doesn't have very high base damage to begin with. Star Eaters boost every Hunter super by 70%. So this is another thing where if Bungie ever introduces a Hunter damage super, it needs to be scaled with Star Eaters in mind. So Star Eaters are just that shifting when it comes to damage. They are one of the only exotics in the game that are actually able to push a damage super over being damage loss over weapons, right? So I'm going to go ahead and put them in the S tier. We're going to put them at the bottom of S tier because they without them, Hunter would have almost nothing when it comes to super damage, right? They are part of the reason Hunter is seen as like a damage specialist when it comes to endgame content. They are like half the reason, basically, right? Star Eater Blade Barrage is just that strong. Okay. Next up, we are going to talk about the Bombardiers. The Bombardiers. I think they're up here somewhere. I think, yeah, this list, again, doesn't count T, the starting with T. It starts with the B. Okay. Bombardiers, I tried using these in a solo gem, again. And, yeah, the explosive is bad. It's very bad. It stinks. It does, like, no damage. The effects, half the effects are, like, cheapened versions of their normal subclass effects. And they require you to use a dodge, which is not the shortest cooldown ever, right? It's just, they're bad. They're pretty bad. They're like the definition of a gimmick exotic. These things basically have no use in endgame content. I'm gonna go ahead and put them in the F tier. Put them in the F tier underneath Lucky Raspberry, and we'll call it and move on. Okay. Next up, we have the Dragon's Shadow. The Dragon's Shadow, again, if quick swapping doesn't get patched. These things have some use, I guess, in quick swapping. I think Dragon's Shadow is a little bit overrated for like triple rocket rotations. A lot of people seem to think they're very good for that. Dragon's Shadow is outdamaged in total damage and a similar DPS to Foetracer rotations, and is flat out outdamaged by, like, out DPS'd by Radiant Dance Machines rotations. So, you know, it's cool, and it makes your guns feel really good, but On Your Mark exists, and so do Speedloaders, and the Dragon's Shadow is like, I don't know, it has some unique properties, but it very much feels like a more PvP-oriented exotic at this point, and any use that it has in PvE is very niche and very limited. I'm going to go ahead and put the Dragon's Shadow in the B tier. I'm going to put it at the bottom of B tier, and we're going to put it in, yeah, right over here, I think. Yeah, bottom of B tier. Yeah, makes sense. Okay, next up we have the Sixth Coyote. Now, the Sixth Coyote was kind of a fan favorite on, like, Invis Hunter and some of the other exotics of the Year 4 heyday. That being said, Sixth Coyote, just getting an extra dodge these days doesn't really do much for you. On Void Hunter, you're definitely going to be playing Gyrfalcons over this. And on other classes, you get your dodge pretty fast, right? On Arc Hunter, you get it from one melee kill. On Solar Hunter, you can get it through Singeing and Benevolence. It's just very easy to get your dodge back now. And having an extra dodge is like, who cares? So the one thing that I will say that Sixth Coyote can be useful for is getting a second reload dodge when you have no enemies near you to proc Radiant Dance Machines. Now, that being said, that's pretty rare, and also that's not that useful. But it's useful in like some speedrunning aspects. Like it was used, for example, in Garden of Salvation speedruns because there's no enemies near you. So you would just, you know, be able to dodge reload a Clown Cartridge Hothead twice without having any enemies near you. But that's that's extremely niche, and I'm not going to give it really any points for that. So Sixth Coyote, unfortunately, we're going to smack it into the D tier, and we're going to place it right over here. Okay. Next up, we have 3 exotics left. We have Triton Vice. Triton Vice is, I think, the only exotic in the game that is explicitly centered around glaives. I tried using this in, again, a solo GM, and it was bad. It was bad. The glaive melee damage increase was almost unnoticeable. The explosion is relatively small, and even with the projectile buff incoming next season to glaive damage, it is not going to be enough to make this thing scale into upper tier content. The overflow is nice, but again, like, I don't know, dude. If you want to use glaive melee spamming as a build in endgame content, you're much better off going for an exotic that boosts your damage higher than 30%. So again, something like Worm Gods, something like Winter's Guile, and then using something like Devour so that you're not dying. This thing does not have any of those properties, and if you're glaive meleeing, you know, majors, mini bosses, even tanky red bars in a GM with this exotic, I wish you the best of luck. Okay, Triton Vice. With that being said, I'm going to put that in the D tier. We're going to put it above Raiden Flux, and yeah, we're going to call it at that. Okay, finally, the last 2 exotics on the list. We have Wormhusk Crown. Wormhusk Crown is sorely in need of a rework. This thing is the most basic bitch exotic on the block. On your dodge, you get 67 health. That is it. This is very much a PvP exotic. It is very much not a PvE exotic. If you want survivability, there are 1,001,363 ways to get healing that is more consistent than waiting for a dodge. And this ain't it, Chief. This ain't it. Wormhusk Crown, we're going to go ahead and put that in the F tier. Right over here. Okay, finally, we have probably the most interesting exotic on this list, given the recent change. Okay, and that is Young Omkara Spine. Oh boy. Bungie. Why'd you do this? Man? Why'd you do this? Okay, Young Omkara Spine is probably like an A tier exotic, high B tier, low A tier exotic, and then they took it round back, they brought it to the family farm, they pull out the double barrel shotgun, and they put it down. They put it out of its glory. Okay, pour one out for Young Omkara Spine. One of the better solar neutral exotics. It wasn't even unbalanced, okay? Young Omkara Spine, I wouldn't even have called it like a meta-defining exotic. It wasn't a super strong exotic. It was just good. You know, I think Young Omkara Spine was just a solid exotic. I think all exotic armor should try to aspire to be what Young Omkara's was, okay? Because look, it's decent ad clear, right? You can make a bunch of fire sprites with it. It has some survivability. Trip mines don't do insane boss damage, right? I know people like making trip mine rotations. They're actually damage loss. So it's not insane for boss DPS. It's just a good neutral exotic that makes good use of trip mines. And I think it's like a unique exotic. It's good. I like it. It's a cool exotic. And then they, you know, it's like, it's unusable now. It's almost unusable in endgame content, right? You're not getting nearly enough kills to supplant this thing's gameplay loop. And in the content where you are, your trip mine grenades are not very good in that content because their blast radius is just not very good, right? So this sucks. I'm sad. It's crazy because like the other knife exotics are all like better than this thing now, right? Like you'd rather use Calibans or you'd rather use, you know, Athrys Embrace, right? It's yeah, I don't know. It's a shame. Classic example. I'm probably gonna make a video at some point about all the times that Bungie has nerfed / ruined things in the PvE sandbox as a result of PvP. And this is one of the most striking examples from the past 2 years or so. So, well, I hope you got what you wanted. Maybe people won't complain in Trials as much about Young Omkar's spine. We're going to go ahead and place it in the D tier. We're going to go ahead and place it in the D tier. I'm going to place it right underneath Sixth Coyote. There's literally no reason to use this thing, even comparing against some of the C tier exotics. A real shame, but yeah, that's pretty much it. That leaves my opinions on the Hunter exotic tier list. I know ATP will be hounding me for this, although I think he was here for part of the creation, so maybe he's not as unhappy as I think he is. But I hope these rankings made sense to you guys. I've kind of discussed the use of all of these exotics. I learned about the Blight Ranger thing recently, so some of you are probably surprised to see this above F tier. The orbs that this thing shits, I've seen it. Titan's Gate sent me a screenshot. Pretty insane. Very niche, but in its niche, very, very powerful. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. I hope you guys enjoyed, and next up, we're probably going to do perks. I think I'm going to do weapon perks next. That's going to be like a 6-hour video. I hope you guys are excited for that. Anyways, bye.